On September 24th, 2005, Michelle Vanek set out on what should have been a routine day hike in Colorado's rugged Holy Cross Mountains. But as the hours passed, and her friend returned to find she had vanished without a trace. What began as a simple hiking trip spiraled into one of the most enduring mysteries in the Rockies. Despite the tireless efforts of over 200 searchers, no sign of Michelle was found. Until 19 years later. A discovery deep in the wilderness reopened a chapter long closed. How could someone disappear in broad daylight in the age of satellites and modern technology? Today, we will delve into the perplexing case of Michelle Vanek, retracing the path of her disappearance for almost 2 decades. Share with us where you're listening from. Make sure to follow our channel for more true investigations into cases that time has yet to solve. On the crisp morning of September 24, 2005, Michelle Vanek, a 35-year-old office administrator from Lakewood, Colorado, set out for what was meant to be a simple day hike, a routine escape into nature to clear her mind and get some exercise. For Michelle, hiking was something she did to stay fit, not an adventure she sought, but a familiar part of her life to maintain balance between family and work. Michelle was a devoted mother of 4 young children and worked full-time at an insurance firm in Denver, known for her disciplined and organized nature. She balanced her career with a deep commitment to her family and faith. Hiking was an activity she'd often engage in with friends or occasionally on her own, but it was always something she did to unwind and stay healthy, rather than seeking out the dangerous thrills that some adventurers might crave. Her hike that day was to Mount of the Holy Cross, a mountain that rises 14,005 feet above sea level in the Sawatch Range. This was to be Michelle's first attempt at summiting a 14er, a term for mountains over 14,000 feet. It wasn't a major goal to conquer such a peak, it was merely the next step in a recreational activity she enjoyed. Her companion for the hike was Eric Sawyer, a friend from a local church sports group. Eric, a seasoned hiker with extensive experience in the area, had summited Mount Holy Cross several times before. He was familiar with the trail and the terrain, and he agreed to join Michelle for the day. According to Eric's later account, the plan was simple. They would begin the hike early in the morning, reach the summit by midday, and descend before evening when the weather could turn unpredictable, as it often did in the Colorado Rockies. They departed from the Half Moon trailhead just before 5 a.m., each carrying lightweight day packs filled with essentials for a one-day trek: food, water, a light jacket, and a compact first aid kit. Neither of them carried a satellite phone or GPS tracker, which were optional for hikers in that era. In fact, in 2005, it wasn't mandatory to register with rangers for this particular trail. The hike began under ideal conditions: clear skies, mild winds, and temperatures in the 50s. The early morning light cast long shadows across the path, which was initially shaded by trees as they moved toward the upper basin. As the hikers made their way up, Michelle seemed to be managing just fine. They spoke casually about her family, her children, and even her work back in Denver. As they passed through the tree line and began to gain altitude, the terrain grew rockier, but nothing felt out of the ordinary. By all accounts, Michelle seemed in good spirits and good health as they made their way toward the summit. Eric recalled that they had been moving steadily and making good time, with plenty of energy for the climb. The mountain's east face, still dotted with late-season snow, provided stunning views as they continued upward. But the main trail was clear and easy to follow. However, at around 11:15 a.m., as they reached a narrow section just below the summit ridge, less than half a mile from the top, Michelle began to show signs of fatigue. Her pace noticeably slowed. She told Eric that she was feeling tired and almost out of water, though Eric suggested they stop for a rest. Michelle was determined to keep going at her own pace. She urged him to continue ahead and said she would take a break and follow once she caught her breath. Eric pointed to a flat rock beside the trail, just off the main path, and reminded Michelle to stay there until he returned. He made sure she was comfortable, gave her a brief smile, and continued upward, climbing toward the summit. This would be the last time he saw Michelle. Eric later estimated that he climbed for another 10 to 15 minutes before turning back to check on Michelle. But when he looked down, she was no longer sitting at the rock. At first, he assumed she had simply continued slowly behind him, or perhaps had begun descending back down the trail, thinking that would be the best decision given her fatigue. But when Eric called out her name, there was no answer. He descended back down the trail, searching the area. A radius of roughly 200 feet, but found no sign of her. There were no footprints leading off the trail. No sign of her day pack or water bottle left behind. He continued to search the area, moving farther down the slope toward the junction of the main trail, all the while calling her name, but with no response. The weather was beginning to change, with clouds starting to form in the sky, and Eric was growing uneasy. By the time Eric reached the trail junction, he had seen no sign of Michelle. Two hikers descending from the summit reported they had not seen anyone who matched Michelle's description. At that point, Eric's concern turned into a full-blown panic. He began moving more quickly, checking every side path and looking into clearings, hoping to catch a glimpse of her or hear a response. The hours were ticking by, and the weather was starting to deteriorate, with the temperature dropping as it often did in the Rockies. By 2 p.m., Eric had reached the tree line and realized he was alone on the mountain. By the time Eric reached the Half Moon trailhead around 3:30 p.m., his heart was pounding with a mixture of dread and disbelief. Michelle's Subaru, a blue 1999 Forester, was parked exactly where she had left it that morning. The sight of her vehicle, untouched and silent, was both a relief and a growing source of anxiety. It was strange how something as ordinary as a parked car could stir up such intense emotions. There it sat, in stark contrast to the turmoil swirling inside Eric's mind. Eric's first thought was that Michelle had simply decided to descend early, tired from the hike, and he just hadn't caught up with her yet. Maybe she was already in the parking lot waiting for him, thinking he would be along soon. But as he opened the car door, the reality hit him like a freight train. There were no signs of panic, no frantic search for something Michelle would need to survive. Her jacket lay draped over the front seat, a water bottle half empty beside it, her keys and phone untouched. Everything was neat in its place, almost as if she had just stopped for a moment and would return shortly. But Michelle hadn't returned. And now, the silence of the mountainside seemed to press in on Eric like a suffocating weight. He stood there for a moment, frozen, his mind racing. He had been so sure Michelle was just behind him, so sure that she would catch up once she rested. But something was wrong, something he couldn't explain. He checked the time. It had been hours. By now, Michelle should have been waiting for him at the trailhead, or at least somewhere along the way. Eric immediately dialed the number for local authorities, his fingers trembling slightly as he pressed the buttons. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but steady. "I need to report a missing hiker," he said, trying to keep his voice from betraying the panic rising within him. "She's my friend. She's gone. We were hiking on Mount Holy Cross. She was with me, and I left her resting about a quarter mile from the summit. She hasn't come back, and I can't find her." The dispatcher on the other end of the line gave a series of instructions, asking Eric to stay at the trailhead and wait for authorities to arrive. He hung up the phone and looked around. The landscape was peaceful, too peaceful. The mountain, which had seemed like such a companion on the hike up, now felt ominous. The wilds were beautiful, but indifferent to the human lives within them. Eric's thoughts immediately went to Michelle. He tried to tell himself that she was fine, that she was probably just tired and had lost track of time. Maybe she had wandered down the mountain a little and would be back soon. But there was a gnawing doubt in his gut, a feeling he couldn't shake. Michelle had been strong, determined, but she wasn't invincible, and he had left her behind. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, waiting for authorities to arrive. He thought back to earlier in the day how casual they had both been, how they had joked about the difficulty of the hike and talked about their families. But now that all seemed so distant. Now, he couldn't help but replay every word, every glance, every step they had taken, trying to pinpoint the moment when things had changed, when Michelle had vanished, around 4 p.m. A deputy arrived at the trailhead. He was followed by a few other officers who immediately began asking Eric questions about Michelle, what she was wearing, what supplies she had, where she had been last seen. Eric answered as best he could, trying to remember every detail. But it was difficult. He was so focused on the growing dread inside of him that the details felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. She was wearing a gray fleece pullover, dark hiking pants, and light-colored running shoes. Eric said, his voice cracking slightly. She was carrying a red day pack. With her wallet, phone, and keys inside, she said she was fine. She smiled. I thought she just needed to rest. When I came back, she was gone. The deputy listened carefully, nodding as Eric spoke. The deputy asked for the coordinates of the last known location, which Eric provided from the memory of their conversation. He knew exactly where Michelle had been sitting. It was a flat rock by the trail, just below the summit ridge. She had looked fine when he left her, but now she was gone without a trace. As the deputy began to take down notes, Eric's mind raced again. He couldn't help but imagine the worst. What if something had happened to Michelle? What if she had fallen or gotten lost in the fog? What if she was lying somewhere, hurt and unable to call out for help? The thought of her alone on that mountain, helpless and afraid, was almost too much to bear. Once the deputy finished taking notes, he radioed for backup. The search and rescue team would need to be alerted immediately. The evening was closing in, and the weather in the mountains could turn quickly. In less than an hour, darkness would descend on the trail, and searching would become even more difficult. Eric was instructed to stay at the trailhead, where the search team would organize. It was hard to sit still, to remain idle, but he had no other choice. As he waited, he felt like a failure. He had left Michelle behind, and now she was missing. The guilt twisted inside him, tightening with every passing second. Why hadn't he insisted that they stay together? Why hadn't he stopped sooner? He tried to push those thoughts away, but they kept coming, each one louder than the last. The morning of September 25th, 2005, brought no relief. The first rays of sunlight crept over the jagged peaks of Mount Holy Cross, casting long shadows across the trailhead. For Eric, it felt like the longest night of his life. The quiet, peaceful scenery before him, so familiar just hours ago, now seemed like an indifferent backdrop to the chaos that was unfolding in his mind. The search for Michelle, which had begun as a routine outing, had quickly turned into something far darker. He had spent the entire night unable to sleep, replaying every moment, every step they had taken together on the mountain. But still, no answers. The search team arrived at first light. A group of volunteers from the Vale Mountain Rescue Group, their faces weary from their own experiences with the treacherous Rocky Mountain terrain. Eric barely noticed their arrival, too absorbed in his own thoughts. His mind spinning with the same questions. Where was Michelle? How could she have disappeared without a trace? By 6:30 a.m., the formal search had begun in earnest. The rescue team split up into smaller groups, each given a designated sector to search. The mountain, though stunning in its beauty, presented numerous challenges the higher they climbed, the thinner the air became. The rocks underfoot were treacherous, and visibility, even at the best of times, could be limited. But this morning, the weather was perfect. Clear skies, a slight breeze, and temperatures in the low 50s. Despite the ideal conditions, the search felt like an impossible task. The mountain had already proven its ability to hide its secrets. Michelle could be anywhere, and with no clues to go on. The sheer scale of the terrain made it seem unlikely that she would be found. Eric had been asked to stay behind, but the anxiety gnawed at him, making it impossible to just sit idly. As the teams began their search, Eric felt himself growing restless, wanting to be a part of the effort, to do something more. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing Michelle, that his role in this story had been reduced to standing on the sidelines while everyone else was actively searching for her. Around 8 a.m., helicopters began to take to the skies. Their blades whipped through the air as they scoured the mountain's upper slopes, using infrared sensors to detect any heat signatures. The idea was that Michelle, if she were alive, might have been hiding or waiting for rescue. The helicopter teams were crucial in covering vast areas quickly. But despite their best efforts, the infrared readings showed no sign of life. There were no warm bodies, no heat sources indicating Michelle's presence. Eric watched helplessly as the helicopters flew overhead, their movements swift and methodical, but they offered no breakthrough. By noon, after hours of searching, the first teams returned to the trailhead, having found nothing. The frustration was palpable. The searchers were used to difficult terrain, but this mountain seemed to fight them at every turn. Despite covering miles of rocky paths and dense forests, no footprints, no signs of Michelle, no items left behind. Everything seemed normal, too normal, like she had never been there at all. The decision was made to expand the search area. By this time, additional search teams had arrived, and more people were assigned to comb through different sectors. A helicopter was sent to fly grid patterns over the eastern and northern faces of the mountain while on the ground. Rescue teams continued their search in earnest. The scale of the operation grew larger by the hour. Still, the hours passed without a single clue. As the afternoon wore on, the weather began to change. Clouds gathered on the horizon, obscuring the mountaintop. The breeze picked up, and by mid-afternoon, a light rain began to fall. It wasn't a storm, but it was enough to make the search more challenging. The rain created slick surfaces on the rocks, making footing treacherous. The teams were forced to slow down and take extra precautions, each step more deliberate than the last. Eric knew how quickly the weather could turn in the Rockies. A sunny morning could quickly give way to a dangerous storm in the afternoon. His heart sank as he thought about Michelle, alone in those conditions. She had been an experienced hiker, but no one could be prepared for the sudden changes in weather that these mountains could bring. If she had taken a wrong turn, if she had misjudged the terrain or gotten disoriented, the risk of her being exposed to the elements was growing by the minute. Around 4 p.m., the teams took a brief break, gathering at the trailhead to regroup. It was a moment of quiet before the next push. Eric's anxiety only deepened as the minutes ticked by. There was still no sign of Michelle. No footprints. No calls for help. No objects left behind. It was as if she had simply vanished. Eric couldn't shake the image of her sitting on the flat rock, resting when he had left her behind. What had happened? Had she wandered off the trail, disoriented, unable to find her way back? Had she fallen? Or had something else happened? Something neither he nor the rescuers could fathom. The official search began to stretch on for another day. The following morning, September 26th, 2005, saw more teams arriving to assist in the effort. The search had now expanded from just a few sectors to the entire western face of the mountain. The response was overwhelming. There were teams of volunteers, helicopters, dog units, and law enforcement. Yet, despite the swelling numbers, there was still no sign of Michelle. The weather remained overcast, and the search teams moved methodically through the terrain. But the sense of urgency was growing. The longer Michelle remained missing, the more the possibility of finding her alive began to slip away. By the end of the second day of searching, more than 200 people were involved in the operation. Yet, even with this many eyes on the mountain, no new clues emerged. The frustration mounted. For every piece of ground covered, There seemed to be more questions than answers. Could Michelle still be out there? Had she been lost? Or had something more sinister happened to her? Eric, exhausted and disheartened, stood on the edge of the mountain, looking out over the vast landscape. He thought back to their conversation that morning on the trail, to the moment when he had said goodbye to Michelle, thinking she was just taking a break. It was the last time he had seen her smiling, confident, as she assured him she'd catch up. Now, standing in the same spot, he couldn't shake the feeling that if he had just stayed with her a little longer, maybe everything would be different. But there were no answers. There was only the mountain, silent and indifferent. By September 27th, 2005, the search for Michelle Vanek had reached a critical point. The previous days of scouring Mount Holy Cross, combing through dense forests, rocky cliffs, and inaccessible gullies, had yielded no significant results. The sheer scale of the operation, with over 220 trained rescuers, sheriff's deputies, park rangers, and volunteers from neighboring towns, had only highlighted the vastness of the mountain and the difficulty of finding someone lost in such a rugged environment. Despite the seemingly ideal weather conditions, the mountain had continued to withhold its secrets. The skies had cleared in the morning, but clouds rolled in by afternoon, adding a layer of tension to the already stressful search. The temperature had dropped, and with the cooling air came an increased risk of exposure for anyone stranded on the mountain. Michelle had been out there for days now, and every hour without a breakthrough raised the grim possibility that she was no longer alive. It was around 10 a.m. when a small breakthrough occurred, a piece of evidence that would set off a chain of events, but one that also deepened the mystery. One of the ground teams, working in an area near a steep rock outcrop about 2 miles from Michelle's last known location, discovered something unusual. A single athletic shoe, it was a light gray sneaker, worn and weathered, lying just beyond the reach of a large boulder, half covered by debris. The shoe seemed to have been there for a while, exposed to the elements, with its fabric faded and frayed at the edges. At first glance, it didn't seem significant. It was just a shoe, a piece of clothing left behind by a hiker. But the moment the searcher realized that the shoe was a woman's size 7.5, and that it might belong to Michelle, the stakes suddenly became higher. The shoe was not just another random object lost in the wild. It was a clue. The searcher, aware of the weight of the find, immediately radioed the team lead. Within moments, a few rescuers arrived to secure the site. Photographs were taken. The coordinates were logged, and the shoe was carefully collected for analysis. The discovery was promising, but it was still just a single item, a fragment of something larger. The question remained, where was the rest of Michelle? Why was there only one shoe? And no other signs of her. As the shoe was being analyzed, the team began scouring the area around the discovery site, hoping for more clues. The terrain was harsh, with loose scree and jagged rocks underfoot. The narrow ravine where the shoe had been found was a challenging area to navigate, but the team persisted, moving carefully through the difficult landscape. Despite their efforts, no other items belonging to Michelle were found in the immediate vicinity. There were no footprints, no pack, and no personal effects scattered around the site. Just the shoe. A small, yet significant, piece of evidence. For Eric, the discovery of the shoe brought a strange sense of hope mixed with frustration. The shoe confirmed that Michelle had been in the area, but it didn't explain where she had gone, or what had happened to her after she had been last seen. The shoe didn't answer any of the pressing questions. Did she get lost? Did she fall? Had something more sinister occurred? As the search continued throughout the day, Eric found it increasingly difficult to stay still. The discovery of the shoe had sparked a renewed sense of urgency, but it also raised more questions. Why had Michelle left just a single shoe behind? Had she been forced to remove it in haste? Or had she been injured in some way? Unable to continue. The answer seemed so far away, buried somewhere in the vastness of the mountain. The weather. which had been relatively calm that morning, began to deteriorate once again. By late afternoon, the skies had darkened, and light rain began to fall. The mountain, as it often did, turned hostile. The rain created slick surfaces on the rocky trails, making the already difficult terrain even more treacherous. The helicopter teams, unable to fly due to poor visibility, were grounded, leaving the search teams on the ground to continue their work as best as they could. As the day wore on, the weather worsened, and the searchers were forced to retreat for the night. For Eric, the discovery of the shoe was bittersweet. On one hand, it meant that Michelle had definitely been on the mountain and had not disappeared without a trace. But on the other hand, it raised more unanswered questions. The shoe was a piece of the puzzle, but there were still too many missing pieces. Was Michelle still out there, alive, waiting to be found? Or had the mountain already claimed her? As the search teams gathered at the trailhead that evening, Eric couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness wash over him. The shoe, though an important clue, had not brought him any closer to understanding what had happened to Michelle. He had hoped that by now they would have found her, that they would have had some kind of breakthrough. But it felt like the more they searched, the more the mountain kept its secrets locked away. Eric stood off to the side, watching as the rescue teams prepared to regroup. The feeling of failure clung to him, despite the fact that he knew he had done everything he could. He had left Michelle behind, just for a moment, but that moment had turned into a nightmare that he couldn't escape. As the days passed, the toll on the searchers, as well as Michelle's family, became increasingly evident. For Eric, the emotional burden was overwhelming. The guilt he felt for leaving Michelle alone, even for those few minutes, was something he couldn't shake. Every passing hour, every moment spent away from the trail, felt like a mistake he could never undo. But it wasn't just Eric who was suffering. The Vanek family, too, was beginning to experience the deepening pain of uncertainty. Anthony, Michelle's husband, had arrived on site shortly after receiving the news of his wife's disappearance. He had made the long drive from Lakewood to the base of the mountain, unsure of what he would find, but hoping for the best. When Anthony arrived, he was met by search teams, volunteers, and law enforcement officers. He was briefed on the situation, told that Michelle had been missing for several days and that the search was ongoing. But there was no easy way to explain to him that, at this point, the chances of finding Michelle alive were rapidly diminishing. Anthony refused to accept the possibility that Michelle was gone, despite the cold, hard facts of the search, the lack of evidence, the worsening weather, the overwhelming scale of the mountain. Anthony continued to hold on to the belief that his wife would be found. He stayed on site, helping with the search whenever he could, offering comfort to the rescuers and speaking with the press. He was determined to keep hope alive, even in the face of mounting despair. For the Vanek family, the next few days became a blur of waiting, hoping, and praying. Michelle's children, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, kept asking when their mother would return. The family clung to each other, finding solace in their shared belief that Michelle would come home. But despite the search continuing, despite the efforts of hundreds of volunteers and professionals, there was still no sign of Michelle. The mountain had swallowed her up, and for each day that passed, the likelihood of finding her alive grew slimmer. By September 28th, 2005, the search for Michelle Vanek had reached a critical point. Despite days of searching with no breakthrough, the teams were still working tirelessly to cover as much ground as possible. The mountain had proven to be a formidable opponent, vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to the hundreds of people scouring its slopes. The weather, which had initially been favorable, was now beginning to change. The skies had grown overcast, and the temperature at higher elevations was starting to drop, adding urgency to the search. Every day without any sign of Michelle made the search feel more futile. There were moments when the search teams felt as though the mountain was keeping its secrets locked away, And no matter how hard they tried, they could not seem to break through. The stakes were high. Michelle had been missing for days now, and with every passing hour, the possibility of finding her alive seemed to dwindle. At 10:30 a.m. that day, after nearly 48 hours of searching the immediate area surrounding Michelle's last known location, a breakthrough came. But it was as small as it was unsettling. One of the search teams working on the western face of Mount Holy Cross, a region that had previously been considered too dangerous to explore in depth, made an unexpected discovery. As the searchers carefully moved through the rugged terrain, a combination of rocky outcrops, loose scree, and thick underbrush, one of the rescuers spotted something unusual. It was a single athletic shoe, light gray in color, lying near a large boulder. At first, it seemed insignificant. Just another piece of debris that could have been discarded or lost by some other hiker. But as the searcher knelt down and examined it more closely, they realized the shoe was far more important. It was clearly worn, with signs of heavy exposure to the elements. Its fabric had faded, and the laces were frayed. The shoe was a women's size 7.5, which, to the team, indicated that it very likely belonged to Michelle. The discovery of the shoe sent ripples of shock and hope through the search party. It was the first tangible clue they had found since Michelle's disappearance. There was no doubt that the shoe belonged to someone who had been on the mountain. But the question that immediately sprang to mind was, why was there only one shoe? Where was the other one? And what had happened to the person who had worn it? The discovery, while significant, didn't answer any of the key questions. The rescuers carefully photographed the scene, took note of the coordinates, and documented the item as evidence. The shoe was collected and sent for forensic analysis. But no immediate answers came. The question of how and why it had been left behind, without the owner's other belongings, without a pack, without more clothing, haunted the search team. Had Michelle been in a hurry to remove it? Was she injured and unable to continue, or had something else happened? Something that they still couldn't see. Despite the discovery of the shoe, the search continued. The team expanded their search area, focusing on the surrounding terrain, hoping to find other items that would help piece together Michelle's final movements. They combed through nearby gullies and ravines, carefully checking under rocks and inside crevices. But as the hours passed, the frustration mounted. No new evidence was found. The shoe was still the only clue they had. As the weather worsened, with clouds rolling in and temperatures dropping, the searchers pressed on. The physical toll on the teams was becoming evident. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and the rain that had started falling made the rocks slick and treacherous. The helicopter teams had already been grounded by the poor visibility, and ground teams were moving slowly, carefully, so as not to miss anything in the harsh conditions. Eric, still waiting at the trailhead, was unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. While he appreciated the efforts of the rescuers, he felt increasingly helpless. The discovery of the shoe gave him a sense of hope, but it was still just a single piece of evidence. It didn't bring them any closer to understanding where Michelle had gone or what had happened to her. The shoe raised more questions than it answered. Had she fallen and been separated from her belongings, or had she walked away? Disoriented, only to lose track of where she was, Eric couldn't help but replay the moments in his mind when he had left Michelle behind on the trail. He had believed, at the time, that she was just resting, that she would catch up. But now, he couldn't escape the feeling that if he had just stayed with her, maybe things would have been different. He had left her for just a few minutes, thinking it would be fine. But now, that small moment seemed to be the turning point, the moment when everything changed. As the search continued throughout the day, the weather became increasingly difficult. The clouds thickened, and light rain began to fall, making the terrain even more dangerous to navigate. The search teams were forced to slow down, focusing on safety as much as the search itself. But despite the worsening weather, The discovery of the shoe kept the hope alive. They now knew that Michelle had been in the area. The shoe was proof of that. But where was she now? As night began to fall, the searchers returned to the trailhead, their faces tired and their spirits worn thin. The shoe, though significant, was still the only sign they had found. No other personal items had been discovered, and the weather had become too harsh for any more progress to be made that day. The helicopter team, grounded due to low visibility, could no longer assist, leaving the ground teams to continue their search as best as they could. For Eric, the discovery of the shoe was both a sign of hope and a reminder of the uncertainty that still loomed over Michelle's fate. As the night settled in and the rescue teams prepared for another grueling day, Eric was left with the same questions that had haunted him since Michelle had gone missing. Where was she? Was she still alive? Somewhere on that mountain, waiting to be found? Or had something worse happened? Something he couldn't yet understand. The days of searching had stretched into an agonizing blur of uncertainty. And as each day passed without any new clues, the reality of the situation began to weigh heavier on everyone involved. The discovery of the shoe, while a small breakthrough, was far from a solution. But for now, it was all they had, a piece of the puzzle that they hoped would eventually lead them to Michelle, no matter how long it took. The shift from active rescue to recovery was a painful turning point for everyone involved in the search for Michelle Vanek. But for the Vanek family, especially her husband Anthony, it was not a closure, not yet. As the search team scaled back their operations and the days began to stretch on without new clues, the weight of uncertainty began to take hold. It felt as though the mountains themselves had swallowed Michelle whole, and no amount of effort could retrieve her from its depths. The transition to a recovery mission did not, however, mean the end of hope. For Anthony and the rest of Michelle's family, hope had become something different. It was no longer about finding her alive, but about bringing her home with dignity, about recovering her remains so they could give her the proper closure she deserved. Yet, in the quiet moments between the family's grief, there was still that thread of belief, that tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, Michelle was still somewhere out there. Every year, without fail, Anthony returned to the area. It had become a ritual. A part of him could never stop believing that Michelle might be out there somewhere. Every September, as the mountain's shadow began to grow long with the changing season, he would make the drive from Lakewood to the base of Mount Holy Cross. It wasn't about searching anymore, it was about remembrance, about honoring her spirit, about ensuring that her presence on the mountain was acknowledged even in the silence of her absence. The small town of Minturn, where the search had begun, had slowly moved on with the seasons. New stories of mountain rescues and tragedies began to fill the local news cycles. But for the Vanek family, and especially for Anthony, time had stopped. Michelle's disappearance wasn't just an event that passed. It was a weight they carried with them every day. It had defined them, consumed them, and shaped every action they took, each new year. As the anniversary of her disappearance approached, Anthony would post new flyers, hold quiet vigils, and return to the mountain. There, he would leave flowers at the spot near the summit where Michelle was last seen, a marker of sorts, even though they had never recovered her body. The first few years after her disappearance had been the hardest. The pain of not knowing, of having no answers, left a hollow ache in his chest. He could not move forward, could not settle into life the way others did. But with time, as the family continued their annual pilgrimages to the mountain, their efforts began to shift. Hope was replaced by an understanding that the possibility of finding Michelle alive was growing slimmer. The search had moved from one of frantic urgency to one of quiet acceptance. But still, they kept searching, kept praying, kept hoping in those quiet moments when the weather was too cold for trekking and the mountain was covered with snow. Anthony would sit in his car, facing the ridge, reflecting on the woman he had loved for years. He would think about her smile, her gentle way of caring for their children, and the conversations they had shared. He thought about their plans, their future, and how quickly that future had been taken away from him. It was difficult not to feel bitter at times, at how fate could take someone so dear and leave nothing behind. No answers, no closure. But even in the dark shadows of doubt, there remained an ember of hope that wouldn't go out. Anthony refused to believe Michelle was truly gone. He couldn't. It wasn't just denial, it was love. It was remembering everything she had been to him. And it was a hope that couldn't be extinguished by the mountains or by time, even if the world moved on. Even if other families moved on. Anthony's heart remained tethered to that mountain, to the place where Michelle had last been seen. The place where she had left her mark, however small it may seem now. As the years passed, Anthony did not expect the world to wait for him. But he continued his journey to the mountain, even if it was alone. It was during these quiet trips that he found a strange peace. There were no answers, and there never would be. But he had come to accept that Michelle was gone, at least in a physical sense. The mountain had taken her. And yet, in some ways, it had also given him something back. The rituals, the quiet moments spent alone on the slopes, left him with a sense of closeness to her that he couldn't explain to anyone else. It wasn't just the search, it was the act of remembering, of ensuring that Michelle's spirit wasn't forgotten, of honoring the woman she had been. The Vanek family, in their quiet way, found solace in the ongoing search, even if that meant searching for something intangible. Every year, they posted new flyers, reminding the world that Michelle was still missing, still loved, still thought of. They continued their search for answers, even though the mountain seemed to offer none. It was a quiet defiance against the passage of time, a declaration that Michelle's story had not ended just because she was no longer with them. By the fall of 2010, the case had remained cold. The discovery of Michelle's personal items had been the last real clue in the case. Forensic testing on those items provided no definitive answers. There was nothing to suggest foul play. No indication that Michelle had intentionally disappeared. The official investigation continued, but it was mostly on the back burner now, with no new leads, still, every year. The Vaneks would return to Mount Holy Cross, leaving flowers at the spot where Michelle had last been seen. They continued to hope, even though the odds of a resolution were becoming increasingly slim. And then, in 2010, something unexpected happened. A local resident from Boulder, who had heard about Michelle's disappearance, reached out to the family. Mary Loden, a self-identified psychic, claimed that she had seen Michelle in a dream. Loden described a vision of a woman lying beneath a rock face shaped like a letter V, near a stream. Loden, having no prior connection to the family, was not expecting anything in return, but out of respect for her, the Vaneks decided to follow the lead. They made the trip to the area described by Loden, accompanied by a few volunteers, but nothing significant was found. Yet, the encounter left the family with a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the solution they had hoped for, but for a brief moment, it felt like Michelle was still with them, guiding them, even if only in spirit. The discovery of the fabric that matched Michelle's jacket in 2024, nearly 2 decades later, was another strange turn in the case. When the fabric was found on the western slopes of Mount Holy Cross, it sent ripples through the investigation. The location was eerily close to where Michelle had last been seen. For the Vanek family, it felt like a confirmation of something they had always believed: Michelle had been there. But the discovery came too late for real answers. The fabric was weathered and damaged, and it didn't bring them any closer to understanding what had happened to her. For Anthony, the discovery was bittersweet. The fabric offered proof that Michelle had been on the mountain. But it didn't answer the most important question: why had she disappeared? It was as if the mountain itself was playing a cruel game, revealing just enough to keep the mystery alive, but not enough to solve it. Still, even in the face of these unsatisfactory answers, The family found some small measure of peace. The memory of Michelle remained a living part of them. And each year, they returned to the mountain, to the place where it all began, leaving flowers, holding quiet vigils, and praying for a resolution. The case, officially still listed as missing, may never have closure. But for the Vanek family, Michelle's presence remained with them, and for that, they were grateful. As I followed Michelle Vanek's case over the years, one thing became painfully clear: closure, especially in cases like hers, is a complicated and elusive concept. The search for Michelle on Mount Holy Cross and the long years that followed made me realize that we often mistake closure for finality, for answers we can hold in our hands, something concrete to end the story. But Michelle's case, like so many others, shows that closure is not always about finding answers. Sometimes it's about finding a way to carry the weight of the unknown. The Vanek family's journey exemplified this. The transition from rescue to recovery wasn't just a logistical shift in the search effort, it marked a shift in their hearts. The hope of finding Michelle alive gradually turned into the hope of recovering her remains. Yet, even after all these years, I couldn't help but see that this quest for physical closure was never really the full story. In the act of remembering Michelle in their repeated visits to the mountain, in their rituals of leaving flowers and holding vigils, the Vanek family kept her presence alive, even when answers remained out of reach. I think about Anthony, Michelle's husband, especially his unwillingness to accept that his wife could be lost forever spoke to a deeper truth about love. It wasn't denial, it was love refusing to let go. I wonder if I would have been able to do the same, holding on to the belief that Michelle might still be out there, waiting to be found. But in the years that followed, the search for Michelle became something different. It wasn't just about finding her body, it was about holding on to her memory, refusing to let the mountain erase her completely. The discovery of the fabric in 2024, nearly 2 decades later, seemed like a cruel twist. A single piece of evidence after all this time, a reminder of the many years spent without answers. While that small breakthrough offered a glimmer of hope, it also underscored the central truth of Michelle's story: some questions, no matter how much we search, remain unanswered. The fabric wasn't the resolution the family longed for, but it was a connection, a piece of something that still mattered. In the end, Michelle's story has become a testament not just to the search for answers, but to the importance of remembering, of continuing to honor someone's life even when they're gone. The Vanek family didn't find the closure they hoped for, but they found a way to live with the uncertainty through their rituals, their quiet acts of remembrance. Michelle's presence remained with them. I've learned that sometimes closure isn't about resolving the mystery, it's about learning how to carry the loss and honor the memory of the person who's no longer there. What do you think about Michelle's case and the search that followed? Do you believe closure is something we can ever truly find? Or is it more about the journey of remembrance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story moving, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like the video to help us continue sharing stories like this one. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.